I grew up in a really, really small town. It was a good town, it was a fun town, and we had a lot of outings, but it was a really small town. And what's more about the small town is the fact that I grew up in my grandfather's church. And I remember as a child, one of my most fond memories is that I would watch him stand behind this humongous oaken pulpit and just preach his heart out every single week. I remember I looked up to him so much. I wanted to be him. I emulated him. Everything that he did, I was hoping that I would be able to do. He was such a fiery character. Those were really good times back then. Those were really good times. My aunts and uncles, my cousins, everybody, they were all preachers, and I think that I was destined to be a preacher, but for some reason things went wrong. It got hard on me. I kind of fell into some mess and got involved in some of the wrong things in life and ended up practicing witchcraft, and I got involved in a lot of stuff that I shouldn't have. And I remember it was always my grandfather that was the image that I would turn back to, and he was kind of like the pillar of hope, but at the same time, times were so rough and times were so hard. I got to be honest, I really felt at that point in my life, I was transitioning into a teenager, and I really felt like there wasn't anybody who cared. I kind of felt like I was all alone, and I lost track of who I was. I got involved with the wrong thing. It became really rough on my mom and my family, and I put them through quite a bit. I became quite the character. I dealt in some pretty dirty stuff. Well, I certainly wasn't the boy wonder, but eventually the call of God did catch up to me, and I did feel the draw to become a preacher, and that's what I did. And I was really young, but I was on fire, and I was ready to take the mantle from my grandfather, so to speak. I thought that in the next few weeks, after deciding that I would be a preacher, that I would take this world by storm, and that outreach and the Great Commission would all be fulfilled, and everything would be great. And it was really cool. And I remember the first sermon that I preached, and I remember looking out in the audience. It was a very small crowd, but I saw my grandfather there and my mother, but I saw my grandfather there. And I remember after the sermon he looked at me and he said, "That was good preaching, Ron. That was real good preaching." And it touched my heart to the depth, but there was still a hole. There was still this void in my life that I needed filled, and I couldn't figure out what it was. So I continued to journey on through life, trying to find this hole and fill this thing up, and things just kept getting harder. At that point in my life, I had pastored several churches, and there were good times and there were bad times. I was still the consummate journeyman, and I was always looking for that one thing that I needed. I always felt that no one cared. And it was at that point that it took place. I remember my mom called me and said, "Your grandfather has leukemia, and it's not looking real good." And I remember those months as they ticked by. I remember that it was really hard on him. He was really old, and his life had become really tired, and he was looking pretty rough. He was set up to go for chemotherapy, and my grandfather started crying. He didn't want to take chemotherapy, and he looked at my mom one day and he said, "Janie," is what he called her. He said, "Janie, I don't want to have to go through this mess. I just don't want to have to go through it." And I was at home one evening, the day before he went to take his chemo, and my mom called me that morning and said that he was at the hospital, that there had been an accident. The night before, he had fallen in the bathroom at his house, and my mother was there taking care of him. He couldn't get up, and my mom said that she was there to pick him up out of the bathroom, and he was in a bad way. And I remember getting to the hospital, and I saw my grandfather lying there, and he was in bad shape. The doctor said that it wasn't very promising, and they called the family in, and we were preparing ourselves for the worst. The nurse came in and she looked at the family. She looked at several of Pop's daughters and sons, and said to them, looked at my mom and said to her, "It's time." I remember joining hands with our family as we stood around and we sang hymns as my grandfather left us and went to be with Jesus. And I remember a real emptiness that flooded over my system. And I remember that it was a really hard time. It was an emptiness that I had felt my whole life. And here it was again. I felt like I was all alone. Yeah, I had my mom. Yeah, I had other family members, but Pop was gone. My idol, the one that I had emulated, he was gone. And now I really was all alone, and nobody cared. And there I was. I was empty, and I was broken. And my grandfather was gone. A couple months had passed, and I was still preaching, still doing my thing, and I was trying my best to fulfill the role that my grandfather had left in my life, and it wasn't exactly what I thought it should be. So things just went awkward, and that's when I got a phone call, and I'll be honest with you, it was that phone call that completely changed my life. I answered the phone, and it was a person that I'd done ministry with several years ago. And I remember her voice, it was so soft, and she said something to me that really affects me even right now. She says, "Ron, do you know that I care for you?" When I heard her voice and I heard her say those words, she spoke, and it was so beautiful. Here I was this young kid who emulated his grandfather, looked up to his grandfather, and grew into a preacher, and was a really young preacher who was out there all alone and trying to start churches by himself and do all this stuff. And then there was this horrid divorce, and it was crazy, and everything was going wrong. And then my grandfather died, and someone called to tell me that they cared. When Janice called, it was a life-changing moment because she said that she cared. And it was when I realized that there are people who care. It was the moment that I realized that there are people who take the time out of their lives to focus their lives on the little bit of life that I have. And for the first time in quite some time, someone whom shouldn't have called or shouldn't have cared, they called to express their care. Christianity to me is all about people expressing their care. It's about people reaching out and touching those who really need to be touched. My grandfather touched thousands of people in his life, and I believe that in his ministry and in the way that he approached life, I believe that we can find a great key to the way that we should approach life, and that is living like we want to affect people's lives. And every single moment of every single day that my grandfather lived, he showed his compassion. He showed that he cared for others. I remember that he took some of the smallest churches where he could have took some large churches just so that he could touch people personally. And just because he had an interest in individuals' lives, it was because he really cared. We Care 2.0, I guess, would be best summed up by my grandfather's vision for people. He cared for people, and because of that, he instilled in me and all of my family the ability to care for people also. If I were to say anything, I would say that I owe it all to my grandfather for showing us that he cared. And then I owe it to this woman who ran a jail ministry named Janice, who showed me also that she cared. And I want everybody that watches this to know that we care.